Oh, hi everybody, and thanks for milling in and finding your seats and returning after your adventures for lunch. I'm really pleased to introduce our next speaker, Bill Clark, who's a senior partner at Harper Gray, where he chairs their professional regulation group. I'd also like to thank Brenda Kasaka for making the connection so that we could have Bill here today. Mr. Clark represents clients in both civil and regulatory matters and has acted as counsel for most types of professionals, including doctors, dentists, psychologists, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, engineers, and nurses, so a variety of people. His experience in and intimate knowledge of how regulations such as the Health Professions Act are typically applied and how professionals often structure their practice allow for some very reliable advocacy on his part. So it's really a privilege and a pleasure to introduce Bill today. And so why don't you join and welcome Bill today. Thank you.
Okay. My mic's on, right? So you can all hear me. So thank you for inviting me here today. I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 topics, maybe just 2 really, but they all kind of blend together. And so the focus really is going to be sort of, the changing landscape. But before I get there, I was talking to one of my colleagues, or several of my colleagues in my office about this, and they said, do you really need to give a talk about these things because they're all pretty self-evident? And so you may find it all fairly routine, maybe very knowledgeable in the area already. So the context and the background is that, apart from acting for a lot of professionals, my firm is provincial counsel for the CMPA, and so that's the physicians, and we act for them routinely. And physicians have a lot more experience in a lot of these problems for a variety of reasons, perhaps. It may be that there's more lawyers involved in that context, or it may be that they're less well-trained in some of the areas that I'm about to speak on. And certainly from my experience, as we start with the boundary issue, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about dual relationships and boundaries. Certainly this is a huge problem for many, many, many health professionals, and certainly physicians and perhaps psychologists are no exception. So we'll begin with that. We'll move into some issues of technology and then privacy and the ways in which privacy is being eroded through new technologies and impacting boundaries. So dual relationships, I think we all know what they are. It's pretty simple. It's where you as a therapist, on the one hand, have another relationship as well with that individual client or patient. And it can, of course, lead to problematic management issues in terms of the therapeutic relationship, but also the personal relationship. So, again, the self-evident nature of it, they're everywhere, dual relationships, right? Friend, client, for lawyers, economic relationships with clients are a big issue. And so they permeate all aspects of our professional lives. And some professions prohibit them, some don't. And of course, because it's psychologists here, I thought we would focus on some of the code of conduct from the Provincial Psychologists College, which basically says, very simple words, a registrant must not undertake or continue a professional relationship with a client when objectivity or competency of the registrant could reasonably be expected to be impaired because of that other relationship. And we can see there immediately your college, if you're a psychologist, but this is really akin for most professions and health professions, speak of familial relationships, social, sexual, emotional, financial, supervisory, political, administrative. Essentially any other relationship which you could have with an individual when you have a professional relationship, the college becomes concerned and engaged in how that is to be managed. And of course, as psychologists, again, the clarity here for psychologists is much greater than it is for other health professionals. But there's a positive obligation on the part of the therapist or the psychologist in this case to actually constantly identify those conflicting roles. And once they're identified, then to manage them. So we can begin with a simple thought. You are providing care, and this happens often in the context of youth and children and matrimonial conflict. You're providing care to an individual, and now there's a marital conflict. And which role or what role are you expected to play in that litigation as it moves forward? We as lawyers insist that you're a material witness. We want you to testify for our client. And the really complex questions, ethical and legal, arise whether or not you can do that sort of thing. Now, again, this is self-evident to me. I hope it is to you, but the concept of dual relationships and the regulation of those dual relationships or boundary violations and crossings has really been subject to a lot of change over the last 100 years of your profession and in psychiatry. And Thomas Gutheil, who's a psychiatrist at Harvard, that book, by the way, is co-written by a registered psychologist, really articulates that these changing mores within the profession have dramatically altered through the history of psychotherapy and psychiatry. Historically, boundary issues weren't viewed as significant as they are today. However, obviously, courts and lawyers and the criminal law, to a certain extent, has responded to the perception that patients, clients are vulnerable. And obviously, as you're all aware now, for the last 30 or 40 years in any event, increased legal and ethical concerns over these. So lots of research in the area that has resulted in litigation and has resulted in claims being brought, demonstrating that either through care or in the legal context, that boundary violations and boundary issues present profound problems for your client population. And that has resulted in a huge literature. And this essay, I suppose, perhaps some of you are aware of, but it was really called the Exploitation Index by Drs. Epstein and Simon, developed sort of the first lexicon or checkbox sheet which many, many, many regulators, both in the US and Canada, have relied upon to sort of identify those types of scenarios which lead from a boundary crossing to a boundary violation. So just some, I think these slides are going to be made available, so I'm not going to read them all in the interest of time. But again, there are obviously the notion that maintenance of a therapeutic boundary is very, very, very important for the development of therapeutic trust, and violations of that or modifications of that boundary can therefore undermine that therapeutic relationship. So when we're representing clients or when you're before your regulatory agency, these are the sorts of issues that become of some concern in the therapeutic context. And these, again, arise out of that Exploitation Index article I referred to. So, again, and I think there's a couple of slides later on, but we can think of a typical scenario that presents in the lawyer's office for a physician or a psychologist or a social worker, very innocent often, which is, for instance, the very complimentary patient, the patient who is very thoughtful and appreciative of the care that's being provided, and that leads into an informality. And that informality results in self-disclosure, and then that self-disclosure results in the patient internalizing the belief that this person is interested in them, the therapist is interested, which then leads to the cup of coffee. And the cup of coffee, of course, progresses further down that road to an intimate relationship. So these authors started to identify or tried to identify questions that therapists should constantly ask themselves in terms of their therapeutic relationship, as I guess what people in the health professions or mental health professions would call transference and countertransference phenomenon. I'm a lawyer, so I don't purport to understand those concepts, but essentially that is the focus of the inquiry that is undertaken by the regulator or the court in terms of how to analyze these once something has gone wrong. So the underlying legal and ethical theory is pretty straightforward, that the healthcare professional's obligation, of course, is first to consider really the best interests and only the best interests of their patient. As a health professional, we are not there to be gratified ourselves through that relationship. That's prohibited. We are really only there to protect and further the best interests of the client's welfare. The theory, again, I'm assuming you're all aware, is that these dual relationships, or the power imbalance that's created by the health professional's expertise, makes the individual vulnerable to the manipulation on the part of the therapist. And so lots of statements in that, in the codes of conduct and in the legal literature, and also the academic literature that arises out of your own professional obligations. Now, again, I feel somewhat reticent in discussing this with psychologists more, again, than perhaps the standard family physician, which I often speak to. But one can think of it this way in terms of a normative criteria. As I understand your professional literature reinforces kind of two independent observations. The first one is that, of course, you're there to protect the best interests of the patient at all times, and there's an ethical injunction to prohibit any manipulation of the patient, and therefore those boundaries are very tightly constrained to protect the patient's best interest. But the academic literature goes much further than that, beyond the ethics, and really says that maintenance of the boundary is also actually the provision of good care. This isn't merely about ethics. It's also about standard of care. And so you can talk about a rule-based objection, right? The rule is don't do these things. But underpinning that rule is really this more foundational concept that those rules exist because it's only through the creation of those very tight boundaries in psychotherapy that patients can actually get the care that they need. So that's kind of the background, the basic stuff, which I expect you're all aware of. So now if we go to talk more about the regulation of types of activities, and again, I've already mentioned those, but they're pretty clear. They're economic, familial, largely, and sexual. And for a psychologist, as for a physician, virtually all of those relationships are absolutely prohibited. Or to put it differently, you can't have a friendship and be a psychologist. There are perhaps exceptions for certain classes of physician, or perhaps nurses or social workers in smaller communities. So if you practice in a small community and it's inevitable that there may be some social interrelationship with a patient, that might be fine. But psychologists are probably held to a higher standard in that regard than other health professionals, recognizing largely that when it gets to the mental health, the need for trust and privacy and security of the therapeutic relationship is generally considered much greater than it would be for other types of healthcare. So, the examples, the first one, very, very simple, economic prohibition. Certainly there's lots of cases in Canada involving mainly physicians, again, being disciplined by their regulatory bodies, their colleges, for entering into business transactions with patients. But there's also prohibitions, and again, this is the college's code of conduct. There's also a concern over gifts. And again, I'm not aware of any psychologists being disciplined for accepting nice gifts, but certainly there have been in Canada cases where physicians and psychiatrists have been sanctioned quite severely for the receipt of substantial economic gifts. The notion being, obviously, that the patient expects something in return for the receipt of that gift, and the healthcare provider's behavior may be modified if they accept that gift. And again, the College of Psychologists, of course, also talks about different types of economic relationships also being problematic. The one that, as a lawyer, it appears to us that you as health professionals are always most surprised by is the prohibition on the treatment of family members or friends. And there are, of course, cross-cultural and other normative considerations that apply. Various cultural groups may have different expectations in terms of what's appropriate. The underlying principle, again, is that dual relationship, that familial relationship or that friendship, completely undermines the therapeutic relationship. And, the best example or the easiest example that I can think of is the circumstances where you may be, and again, this probably doesn't arise for psychologists, but clearly arises for physicians all the time, is where they are providing care to both partners in a sexual relationship, a married couple, or the like. And one of them engages in risk behaviors that may put the other patient at risk. So that could be, for instance, a sexually transmitted disease. Very common phenomenon, actually, where a patient may come and tell their physician that they've had an extramarital relationship and they now have an STD. But if that physician is treating the other patient, then the spouse, then that physician likely has a duty to disclose that to the other patient. And of course, if you're friends and you travel in the same social circles, you can see the impartiality and the ability to provide care in those circumstances is clearly undermined. And of course, it's not merely sexual relationships that are prohibited, but things like sexual harassment, sexual comments, and the like. So it goes on and on and on. It's all in your code of conduct, and it's here, and I don't need to belabor the point too much. But if you are contemplating an inappropriate sexual relationship, it's interesting that there are different jurisdictions in North America have different prohibitions. And 5.15 there basically provides that there is a 24-month prohibition for psychologists in British Columbia. Not necessarily 24 months is enough, though, right? It is, in essence, a concern about whether the ongoing influence out of the professional relationship continues. That's what the courts have said, more clearly than perhaps what this has said. So if a patient remains vulnerable, if a patient remains under the influence of this professional, then the prohibited relationship continues indefinitely. Some jurisdictions in the U.S. Prohibit it forever and make it a criminal relationship. So there are cases in Canada, of course, not referred to here, but a sexual relationship with a vulnerable patient out of a therapeutic relationship likely meets the threshold for a criminal offense, and so you would run the risk if you had a sexual relationship as well that find yourself convicted of a criminal offense. Yesterday or the day before, I was driving home. I can't remember. There was a court case from Ontario High Court. Just came down, albeit involving an anesthesiologist, but he was just sentenced to 10 years in jail for sexual touching of patients during surgery. Okay, so I've already talked about this concept. It's the one, again, that everybody refers to in the regulation field. It's not merely crossings are okay, right? Like self-disclosure might be fine. Putting a picture of your family in the office might be fine. Disclosing that you're going on holiday might be fine. But it is the way in which those comments are interpreted that lead, according to the literature, to boundary violations. So the boundaries and the respect of the frame of therapy becomes the fundamental and most important way of preventing that slippery slope from arising. Haven't seen much for psychologists and social workers, but again, It's amazing how many cases there are in Canada against physicians for something as simple as a parting hug. How many complaints you might think arise in that situation, particularly where a GP for 20 years might provide care to a family and then suddenly find a parting hug is misinterpreted and an allegation of sexual touching is made. I wanted to put this in because we get a lot of phone calls, both from psychologists and other health professionals, about, do I have to report this person to their regulated health profession if they are having a sexual relationship with a patient or a former client that falls within the code of conduct. The only point I wish to make is that the duty to report is much more complex than usually your college will tell you it is. The first thing is that you need to have reasonable and probable grounds to make a report. In law, that's a very high threshold. It's not a mere suspicion, and it's not a mere rumor. Second, though, if the report comes from your patient or your client, then that report can only be made with that person's consent. That's different than other jurisdictions in Canada, certainly different than in Ontario, which doesn't provide that limitation. But in BC, so if you're coming to this jurisdiction, you have to recognize a duty to report must be based on the patient's consent if the information comes from that consent. And then finally, of course, I'm sure you're all aware that there are issues with respect to cross-reporting. So if it's a nurse or if it's a physician that you're dealing with or a social worker that's registered, you probably have a duty to report them, not merely your own colleagues. So I only make those first remarks, which has taken a lot of time, because I really wanted to talk about this issue as one that is very much an emerging issue in the whole context of maintenance of professional boundaries. Most health professions in North America are struggling with what to do with new forms of social media, what to do with the fact that many younger people, maybe even not so much younger people, now have an electronic presence on the internet. And there's so much out there from relatively problematic ones, perhaps like Facebook, but also things like, I can't remember what it's called, LinkedIn, it's right there, so things like LinkedIn. So again, if we think that as health professionals you're prohibited from self-disclosure generally, and certainly for mental health professionals one can say that, but at the same time you have a profile on the internet that enables your patients or your clients to obtain a lot of information about you. That in and of itself engages that sort of boundary crossing or that slippery slope that I identified a few minutes ago. And in fact, there are increasingly numbers of cases, and I'll talk to you just about a couple of them, where this very issue arises. And I'm not going to tell you about any cases in British Columbia, but I can tell you that I've had several cases in BC involving the obtaining of information from the internet, from mainly Facebook, that have been relied upon by patients to pursue intimate relationships with health professionals, ultimately leading to very serious consequences. So regulators have responded to that by creating guidelines. Now this one is from the College of Physicians in British Columbia, but you can see that they are recommending, for instance, the strictest privacy settings for that type of information. College of Registered Nurses of British Columbia has essentially done the same thing and included reference to, by way of example, avoid blurring boundaries by accepting invitations to be friends with patients. So here are some cases that have just been reported recently in the news or in various journals, but in this case, a patient treated by one of female partners at a GP practice began sending the doctor flowers, attempted to contact the doctor several times on Facebook, discovered information about them. So you can see, if I back up a minute, in a sexual misconduct case, what counsel for the prosecution will attempt to establish is that the patient knows personal and intimate details about you as the therapist. And if that information is widely or easily available on the internet, I suppose you could say, well, that's my defense. But on the other hand, that mere knowledge creates an enormous risk. So that's essentially what that part is. And I've actually already said this. Social media undermines the neutrality of the therapist and the privacy. It's a form of extratherapeutic contact. And in many cases, it has led to stalking types of behavior. I think I've already referenced this issue. Oh, no, I think these slides are out of order, so I'll just deal with this one now. In any event, one of the issues that also arises from all of these new technologies are the issues of, access to the EMR and the protection of healthcare information. But also, as you bring your cell phones into the workplace, and that tendency that we might all have to take a picture of something or to send a patient email through Gmail, things like that, give rise to very, very, very complex problems. So, a couple things, because it was in a hospital, and I know you're all hospital-based practitioners, but I thought I would say this anyhow. Very, very, very clear that the access to the electronic medical record that's now in the hospital is only for the provision of medical care. I don't know if any of you kept or signed a copy of the agreement for Vancouver Coastal that gave you your password. You're supposed to sign something. Apparently some people don't ever have to sign it, but that makes it absolutely clear that any access to any electronic information or healthcare information is not for the purposes of responding to complaints. It's not for the purpose of your own curiosity, but only for that purpose of ensuring that you are providing your patient with your best care. So there are cases out there in Canada where physicians have been disciplined for, again, getting access to medical records for that type of information. So, one of the things, again, and this, again, it's hard to say, the privacy commissioner in British Columbia, for instance, has said that ultimately any healthcare information needs to be fully encrypted if it's on a mobile device. So if we think about Apple and your iPhone, I don't know how many of you know how to encrypt your iPhones, because I don't know how to do that. But it's not merely that type of information. It is also the Gmails and the Hotmails, all of those web-based applications. All of that information does not meet the basic minimal threshold requirement for protection of privacy once it is off of your phone. So the big issue, this is on the horizon, and there's lots and lots of cases and investigations that are arising in the regulation of healthcare where that sort of issue is becoming quite prominent. So these are the slides that were out of order, but here's one, a relatively recent case from Alberta. The physician logged onto an EMR when other practitioners had not signed off. So I guess they left the EMR open, they didn't sign off, and this other physician came in and decided to take a peek at some medical records. Did that 21 times in respect of, I think, more than one patient, and it was done for personal purposes. So obviously, first of all, those of you who didn't sign off were also investigated for the inappropriate access to healthcare information, but ultimately the right person was identified, and in this case you can see that the physician was suspended for 60 days, part of it was set off, but also fined $25,000, and there was publication. So again, that scenario seems simple enough, but if your friend is in the hospital and you want to get information about them, or your loved one, or your boyfriend, or your daughter's boyfriend, the potential regulatory consequences to accessing that information are very significant. This is one that is happening with an amazing degree of frequency. I'm not going to tell you how many files we've had in our office in the last 12 months that relate to photos. I can assure you it's quite a few. To me as a lawyer, it's shocking and remarkable that anybody would ever use their iPhone or their other phone in the office to take a picture, in the hospital to take a picture. It appears to happen with an enormous frequency. In addition to being potentially disciplined, like this physician was, again from Alberta, only a 10-day suspension. I should say this was not an inappropriate photo in that case. It was just taking up the photo. There are bizarre cases, and again, which you may have read in the newspaper, right? Here's one that's just absolutely incredible that anybody would think about doing this, but a 23-year-old model was admitted to for excessive alcohol consumption. The physician allegedly took photos of her and posted them on Facebook and Instagram. So, in addition to being disciplined and perhaps sued, and in the U.S. with punitive damages, probably Canada as well, so your insurer wouldn't help you with that. Obviously, the publication and the humiliation and embarrassment to that physician would be magnificent. And here's another one, right? Again, similar type of issue, bizarre, childish behavior on the part of somebody, but those cameras appear to encourage it. So that's really, just to summarize on the issue of boundaries in technology and privacy, I think I would say that as lawyers, we're seeing with increasing frequency very stupid behaviors involving these readily accessible technology being used as a breach of privacy. Whether that's access to the EMR, on the one hand, or whether it is using your cell phone for the picture, or even sending an email involving a patient-related matter. And the other one that's increasingly common, again, is that laptop that you're using, you leave it in your back seat, it's stolen, and it wasn't fully encrypted. And now the privacy office is going to tell you that if there was any patient information in that, you have to communicate with all of those patients. You have to follow a process. I want to say that the breach of privacy issues are complex for those of you who are not physicians, because it could well be the case that if you were sued for breach of privacy and the like, that you would not have any insurance coverage. So you would be looking at incurring significant defense costs, potentially, as well as paying damages. And I can't tell you if you took a picture of somebody in the ER or in the ward or whatever, an innocent picture of them, and then you emailed it to a friend and that was found out. I can't tell you what the range of damages that you might have to pay would be, but it's probably more than a few $1,000s. Might be somewhere between 40 and 60, or even 100,000 if there were punitive damages. And certainly if there were any sexually explicit element to the photo, you could get up higher. And the other part of it is it doesn't have to be identifiable. You have to understand that, even if you took this picture of somebody and you emailed it, even if you couldn't see who it was, it would still be a breach of privacy. So lots and lots of cases happening in that area. None of them are very reassuring to those of you who have to work in a hospital or as health professionals generally. And I do think, again, just to summarize on that point as well, that as a boundary issue, it's probably where we are seeing most new cases involving serious forms of professional misconduct. That, again, some element of access to Facebook or YouTube or whatever has been part of it. So, again, this is all very basic stuff, and I apologize for that. I'm going to quickly go through this second topic that I mentioned, which really in some sense is related to it, but just the whole concept of confidentiality and its importance in professional relationships. There's a lot of information here. I'm going to go very quickly through it. But first of all, as a matter of law and ethics, it's a complex background. So first of all, patients expect it. The law requires it. It's considered both a contractual and ethical obligation. Indeed, for what it's worth, it was the law that imposed first the duty of confidentiality on the therapeutic relationships generally, and not really ethical ones. But it's now enshrined in the Code of Conduct for you as psychologists or everybody else. And the courts have increased the protection increasingly over time. But there are also lots of exceptions. I'm going to bypass that. The rationale for it, we all know, and I probably mentioned it earlier, it's essential to your therapeutic relationship. Patients want it. If you do not engender a respect for privacy, will that patient, will that client tell you what needs to be told? And so that's the underlying of it. Now, breach of confidentiality, like boundary violations and the like, give rise to many, many legal consequences. First, there are many cases where the health professional has been disciplined. Penalties range from a reprimand to very, very, very severe consequences. There's also the possibility of being sued, I've already mentioned, for a breach of privacy under provincial legislation. And there are regulatory offenses that may arise under the Offence Act as well. So many, many, many legal consequences to a breach. I've already mentioned that there are exceptions, and just in terms of the nature of the exceptions, there are ones that are permissive, ones that in certain circumstances you as the healthcare provider are authorized to disclose, and there are those which are considered mandatory. In terms of mandatory ones, we can begin with when the patient consents to the release of information. If the patient has instructed you to release information, then really you're required to comply with that request. Subject to the exception where disclosure of the information may be very harmful to that patient. Principle arising out of the therapeutic relationship is that there may be, in very limited circumstances, information that disclosure of which would be considered quite harmful. But it's also important to understand, for those of you who are involved in litigation, you have to be very, very, very careful when that patient or a client authorizes the release of information. Simply because the patient has previously indicated, I'm going to consent to that, doesn't mean you simply rely upon that. And again, there's a case here involving very minor damages award, but where the defendant accidentally disclosed too much, and even though it was in the best interests, perhaps, of the court to know that, the healthcare provider who released it was found liable. It's also important to understand that although this is a Supreme Court of Canada decision, although you own the record, right, although it is your record, or in the case of those of you who practice in the hospital's record, patients have the right of access, and the information contained in that record is theirs. So I'm not going to belabor those points. They're very simple for us lawyers, but you can just think of it as this. You may own the paper. I own the information as the patient. Now, as healthcare professionals, just another competing concept is that of implied consent. Obviously, you don't require written consent if it's for the purposes of providing care. But that in many circumstances, those are not easy concepts to apply. I'm just going to say I'm going to go over this quickly. Many of you who are involved in the provision of care, particularly in the community, may be getting inquiries from lawyers involved in litigation. The law in British Columbia, not elsewhere in Canada necessarily, but the law in British Columbia is that when a patient commences an action for damages, so when they sue, they say, I've been injured in this motor vehicle accident, they've put their health information in issue, and they've waived confidentiality. And so the courts have said, in those circumstances, that you patient can't claim that your relationship is confidential anymore. Now, most regulators still disagree with that. They say, we don't care what the courts say, we only care what we think is right, and so ethically, you are still required to protect that confidentiality of your patient. So you may get a lawyer phoning you and saying, well, the action's been commenced, the Supreme Court has said, I can talk to you about it, you're required to talk to me about it. That may all sort of be true, but at the same time, there may be ethical considerations. So I just caution any of you who are ever involved in litigation to never, ever disclose information without ensuring that your patient is aware of that request, and if the patient counsel, to speak to their counsel. So it's more work for you, but it's a requirement. Now, in mental health, this is another issue where there are many, many, many complaints, again, primarily against physicians, because they are dealing with, I guess, the more acutely ill, often the schizophrenics or the suicidal patients, and they're being medicated, and there's a discharge planning meeting. Families always want access to that information, and you just simply have to remember a very simple principle, that it's the patient's information, not the family's. And there are many cases where family physicians or others have been sued because they refuse to disclose information, but at the end of the day, you have to respect your patient's rights. So you may have an extra duty to talk to the patient about getting that information to the patient or the family, but from the patient to the family, but at the end of the day, the patients have the right to decline to release that information. I've already kind of referenced this issue, but again, children is a very, very, very complex issue, and in the normal course, if you're a 14 or a 13-year-old or a 10-year-old, it might not be a complicated balancing that sure, we should share our medical information with the parents because it's in the children's best interest. That's almost invariably true, but not true in the face of matrimonial litigation, where the principles of confidentiality are quite modified. And as you as a healthcare provider have to recognize that you have an added obligation to protect young people and what's in the best interests of the child. And the courts have been very, 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 very clear that you as healthcare providers should be insulated from criticism where you refuse to disclose information to a parent where you think it is in the child's best interest that not be disclosed. So if you have a young person, and I'm not at children's right now, but if you have a young person and you're providing therapy to that person, the age of consent to privacy or the requirement to protect privacy is much, much younger than perhaps other healthcare types of consents. Or to put it differently, you have a 10-year-old even or an 8-year-old who doesn't want information shared with their parents. In the case of litigation between the parents over custody, you probably have to respect that. So it's very, very, very delicate and complex ethical issue in terms of what you can share and when you can't. Now, there's other mandatory types of disclosure. Obviously, there's many, many types of litigation, statutes which exist that require information to be disclosed. Motor Vehicle Act, coroner's report, coroner's legislation, that sort of thing. I don't have time, children and family, I don't have time to take you through all of those. I do want to highlight a problem, though, that we see with quite a bit of frequency. It is where the police or Crown Counsel come to you and say, we're treating your patient, your patient is being investigated, we want information, and you as a healthcare provider feel quite intimidated. Again, a very, very, very important and simple reminder, you do not have to cooperate with the police and should not cooperate with the police without your patient's consent. That is an absolute prohibition. So in this case, went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, but it remains the leading case in Canada. The physician voluntarily disclosed some drug and blood alcohol samples to the Crown and the police, I should say, and the police relied upon that information in prosecuting that person before the courts for impaired driving, causing death, I think. And the court was extremely critical of the healthcare provider, and the evidence was excluded from the court and could not be relied upon. Theory being is that when you're providing care, you need to respect the confidentiality of that relationship. So I mentioned this earlier, but you can see that there's lots and lots of exceptions, statutory exceptions, and I don't have time to take you through those because this is way too long for today's purpose. The most interesting issue for those of you who deal with high-risk situations and the acutely ill, I guess, is those circumstances where you can voluntarily breach confidentiality in the public interest. And I mean, on each of these topics, I could have spent the whole hour, I suppose, just talking about each of them. So this is just kind of some highlights. But this one is, again, an issue that arises infrequently, but when it does for you as the healthcare provider, it's usually a crisis. So this is the case of Smith & Jones. It arose in Vancouver, and almost certainly most of you know the psychiatrist that was involved in this case, if not personally, at least by name. I'm not going to say his name because this isn't used in court. But in this case, the psychiatrist was retained by a lawyer to do an assessment, a forensic psychiatric assessment in a criminal case for the purposes of use at trial or in sentencing. The psychiatrist concluded on the basis of that assessment that this individual was a high-risk offender, likely to offend in the future, and was not really amenable to treatment. The lawyer said, as any competent lawyer would, "Thank you very much. We don't want to use your opinion. It's not going to be helpful to my case. Goodbye." The psychiatrist felt that that was improper, that he thought he had a moral obligation to disclose that to someone, and he sought the direction of the court in releasing that information publicly, to the police authorities, but in a public way. So he's now going to breach confidentiality because he thinks it's in the public interest. And the Supreme Court essentially agreed with that. The Supreme Court of Canada, they ultimately said, where a healthcare provider has certain information falling within that bolded at the bottom, where there's an imminent risk of serious bodily injury or death to an identifiable group or person, then the healthcare provider can breach that confidentiality. So in this case, he wasn't compelled to do it, but merely authorized to do it because of his own moral obligation as he saw it. Principles in that case are actually quite different than the ones in this, but perhaps only difference to a lawyer. This is a very famous case. You probably all learned of it when you were going to school, but the Tarasoff case from California, which essentially has a very similar theory to it that the one I just read, but it's different in this respect. Where you have that identifiable person and you knew that there was a serious risk of injury, you are compelled to act where there appears to be a more substantial likelihood of that act actually occurring. So if we put it within the context of a psychotherapeutic relationship, you have a patient who comes to you and says, "I'm going to go and kill my wife." Now, or my child, which has happened to more than one healthcare provider in BC who didn't act, who did find that somebody was killed as a result. So where you have that degree of specificity of knowledge, it may not be a case of a moral feeling that I have to disclose, but rather a legal requirement that you actually take steps to notify that person. And if you fail to do so, you may be successfully sued for damages. So again, in the case where you have information that looks like a person may commit a very serious act, and there's a reasonable basis for your worry, then you need to take steps to report that to the appropriate person or authorities. Just want to point out that the Tarasoff case has been adopted in Canada, so it's not merely a U.S. case. Clearly, there are obligations to do so. I do have a little bit of time just to follow up on that point. So, we, again, more from physicians than for other groups, get asked this question with quite a degree of frequency. And I don't want you to leave thinking that when you have that situation and the dangerous patient is about to leave the room, that you can act without impunity, if that's the right word. Any efforts to disclose that must be measured and they must be appropriate. And I can put it to you this way. First of all, is there sufficient information in your possession that leads you to believe the person is going to act on this? Is there a foundation? Is this if it's a psychotic person who has no history of violence, do you really feel that there's a sufficient degree to take steps to breach confidentiality? Because once you break confidentiality, you may well be undermining the therapeutic relationship. So that's a delicate issue. And so what we always recommend is consult with a senior colleague. If possible, consult with a lawyer. And recognize that, the breach of confidentiality can have serious consequences. So you could be sued by this patient if you breached on the basis that there was no reasonable grounds to breach confidentiality. You could be the subject to a complaint to your regulator, and your regulator would want to see clear and unequivocal evidence that you were measured and thoughtful. The other thing is to recognize that when you make that report, should you decide that you're going to report it, is you're not disclosing the confidential relationship or the confidential information arising from the relationship. It's not about disclosing the person's background or their diagnosis or their personal circumstances, but it's limited to disclosing the threat. So you basically tell the person, or I would recommend if I were contacted, not to warn the person, but warn the police. I've got a reason to believe that this patient, or this person, I should say, may be threatening this person, and I can't tell. Police will almost certainly try and browbeat you and get more information from you before they act, and you just have to say it arose in a confidential relationship, and I'm not prepared to disclose that. So, in summary then, limits on confidentiality, very, very simple, right? There are lots of exceptions. Some of them are there where you're giving testimony or where you're authorized to, where the patient has disclosed it, where there's a statutory compulsion, or finally this notion where you have an interest in disclosing it. So I'm almost out of time. I was told to leave lots of time for questions, and I'm happy to take as many questions as you want. Yes? So first of all, by express consent, I never mean written consent. Again, as lawyers, we don't care whether it's written or not. The College of Psychologists gets kind of worried about that, but that's really more of a college issue than a legal issue. So express consent means that the client has said information. That's why written consent is really a matter of risk. Again, psychologists are a little bit strange in this area, but for the rest of the health professionals, if you simply document in your chart that consent has been granted, that is sufficient. Implied consent is really where it is necessary you had to consult with one of your colleagues about what to do, how to manage a situation. That would be implied. Back to my example of the duty to warn for a minute, that's not an issue that requires consent. Let's say you wanted to phone what to do with this patient. Here's my scenario. This is the patient's name. What do you think? That consent is implied as a matter of. That's where you are on that continuum, right? How much information can be shared. Often where parties disagree. So, I largely of documentation, right? Not prepared to provide health professionals agree. Colleagues always says that I would have you certify somebody improperly. So it is a risk. How much risk are you prepared to take?
William, thank you for the review. I want to clarify with you about emails. Patients always ask for our email addresses, and I say no. And when they get a little pushy, I cite a case from the States that I heard about where the psychologist gave the email to the patient. The patient later on sends a suicide note via email and commits suicide. And the family successfully sued the psychologist. And the judge made a decision that when you give your email out to a patient, you are agreeing to a responsibility. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay. Well, and I don't think people...
Because, but the answer is yes, but the question is what's the content of that responsibility, right? So if the representation to the if your communication around email, don't review it every day, I'm not going to review it every day, and I will not. The problem for us, though, right, is I think I would be more comfortable. What is changing in patient?
And the psychologist did say, it was just one of those off days. I was really busy, and she didn't get to her email till the end of the day, and it had been posted earlier. And the judge said, too bad.
All factually dependent, though.
Okay. But I don't think a lot of us know that commitment there. But
It's a problem with accessibility for all professionals. I can perhaps 7 o'clock at night. Health providers, anybody that presents a bill.
You're thinking that, and it's not even kind of in light of social media. One could just go onto the Vancouver Coastal website, and there's a wealth of information there. You could find 2 email addresses on there that for HR or whatever, and quickly figure out how to get access to, the email address of every single employee, which is simply first name dot last name. And so that's an interesting thing when you're saying that, if any client, who simply figured that code out and started emailing any kind of a healthcare provider and disclosing, information that way, if that healthcare provider simply didn't respond to that email or even tried to respond to say, this is outside of the boundaries of our intervention, that's an interesting kind of scenario.
Have a solution for you on that, but in the hospital setting, it's much more complex. Background, introducing yourself. Private office setting.
Or it does.
That would be certainly true. Courts have certainly said. One particular person, very modern world. So, that all people that are directly involved in patient care to that patient. Yeah.
That's great. One more question, as we're just running a little behind. Thanks, Simon.
Yeah, no, that's very true. If you say, look, I'm sending you this, but I'm not going to respond or whatever.
Thank you. Just want to thank Bill for coming today and this remarkable narrative on the journey through legals.
All right. So you're. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Of course you are. Talk about that. I'm going to set something else up here. Thank you, and we'll just be moving on, and there'll be a little bit of break after Dr. Hartney is finished with her talk. It's really with great pleasure and privilege that we have Dr. Elizabeth Hartney here today, psychologist from the Ministry of Health, live, not by video from Victoria. And Dr. Hartney is a psychologist working in the Ministry of Health. She is currently working on aspects of the ministry's Healthy Minds, Healthy People plan that I'm sure many of you have read, which is BC's 10-year mental health and substance use plan that aims to reshape how we think about and talk about and approach mental health and substance use across the lifespan. And Dr. Hartney will be talking a little bit about some areas of that plan and that she's going to share with us today. So if you could join me in welcoming Dr. Hartney. Thank you.
Hello. How's everybody's energy doing after the legal presentation? I could kind of feel it. I was thinking, oh no, nobody's going to want to hear from the ministry after this. But can you all hear me okay? Hopefully, the mid-afternoon presentation and all of that, we can kind of maintain some energy here. This is, I hope, of interest to all of you. I think that you've been saving questions for the end. My preference is that people ask questions as we go through if there's something that you're unclear about, rather than wait to the end for clarification, but I'll let you sort of use your judgment with that. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the 10-year plan. Are people familiar with Healthy Minds, Healthy People? Nods in the room. It seems like even though this came out in 2010, there's still lots of healthcare providers who aren't aware of it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the context, and I have some copies there for you to help yourselves, and if they run out, do please get in touch. There's some business cards there, and you can get a copy of this yourself, because I think this is a really empowering document for us as healthcare providers. It sets out a vision, and I'll tell you a little bit about what that vision is. This is straight from the plan. Children, youth and adults from all cultures in BC achieve and maintain sound mental health and well-being, live in communities free of problems associated with substances, access effective support to recover from mental health and/or substance use problems that may develop over the lifespan, and lead fulfilling lives as engaged members of society without discrimination when these conditions persist. So, quite an idealistic vision there, and very, very broad-reaching. So as I say, this plan was published 2010, and so the 10-year lifespan of the plan is from 2010 to 2020. Over 10 years, the plan aims to firstly improve the mental health and well-being of the population. Secondly, and this is the piece that I think we're really interested in today, to improve the quality and accessibility of services for people with mental health and substance use problems. And thirdly, to reduce the economic costs to the public and private sectors resulting from mental health and substance use problems. So there's a little bit more detail about each of those goals, and I'm going to talk a bit about the second one, which I say is really what we're focusing on today. To improve the quality and accessibility of services for people with mental health and substance use problems. So children, youth and adults experiencing mental health and/or substance use problems will be reached by timely and effective interventions and support. Existing systems will work collaboratively to ensure that the necessary treatment and support reaches people with severe or complex mental illnesses and/or substance use disorders. So remember, this is what we're hoping to achieve. This isn't necessarily a description of our state at the beginning of the writing stage of the plan or of where we are now. This is kind of our goal for the end point after 10 years. I'm going to talk a little bit today about a specific deliverable of the plan that I've been leading for the last 2 years, which is around psychotherapy and around the provision of psychotherapy. And there really is just one action in the plan that speaks directly to those kinds of services. Now, just because there's only one deliverable in the 10-year plan in 2010 doesn't mean that there won't be more actions that will come out of that in the next 7 years to come. We're now 3 years in. We're currently in the process of writing our 3rd annual report. And we're also looking to refresh the plan. The new Minister of Health, Terry Lake, has made a commitment to fully implementing Healthy Minds, Healthy People, and that's one of just a few key commitments that he's been able to make as minister. So this really is quite a powerful document, and as I say, we are expecting a refresh of the plan and new pieces of work to come out of it. But at the time of writing, the one deliverable we had around psychotherapy was to enhance the availability of evidence-based therapeutic approaches by increasing the capacity of clinicians to deliver evidence-based treatment services using various levels of intensity and in a variety of settings. And the deliverable itself is that by 2013, a guiding document will be available to health authorities outlining recommendations to increase the capacity for evidence-based psychotherapies for people with mental health and substance use problems. There's a little more than that in the plan if you want to take a look. There's about close to a page just sort of describing the context and drawing particular attention to the, I suppose, what's become the treatment as usual in BC of treating first with pharmacotherapy, first with medications, and perhaps not considering psychotherapy at all. It clearly states sometimes psychotherapy makes more sense than medication, and in some cases the two types of treatment can go hand in hand. Commitment is this document. The document has been developed over the course of the last couple of years, and I'll tell you a little bit about that process. We have recently gone through a whole reorganization at the Ministry of Health and some quite significant changes in terms of the leadership of mental health and substance use. So at this point in time, the document is kind of queued up for approval. I'm really hoping in the next couple of months that it will be available to all of you, at least on the internet, and you'll be able to hopefully start benefiting from all of the intelligence that we've brought together over the last couple of years. But for now, unfortunately, we're going to have to go with what I'm presenting today. Hopefully that'll give you enough of an idea of where this is going, that when it is available, you'll be able to make good use of it. So we went through a 3-phase process with this. Rather, we're still going through a 3-phase process. The first was to start consulting really closely with health authorities around what this document should look like. The plan was really non-specific in terms of what should be included. It talked about evidence, it talked about an alternative or an adjunct to medications, but it didn't really go into a lot of detail about the scope of the document or exactly what should be included in there, although there was a reference to building capacity there. So the first phase, I went out to all of the health authorities and I consulted with them about what they would need for this document to be useful to them. The second phase, which went on really for all of last year, was developing the document itself. And the third phase, which we're kind of currently sort of getting started, even as we're waiting for the document to be released, I think those people who were really very closely involved in developing the document have already started thinking through how it could be taken to the next stage around implementation. And we also, fingers crossed, have a postdoc starting with us very soon in April or May to help for a year with implementing this. So I think if any of this kind of rings bells for you around wanting to connect in with this initiative, do please get in touch. There's cards at the front, because this piece, and I really see my role as a bridge between the world of psychology research and practice and policy. This is effectively a policy document, and it's only really useful if it actually gets implemented and actually changes practice. So this is a good opportunity to let you know, yes, I'm in Victoria in the ministry, and you can always give me a call if you want to talk about ideas you might have for implementation in your own services. So in the first phase, with the consultation with health authorities, I conducted 22 interviews, very in-depth, usually 1 to 2 hours in length, with 30 participants. So some of them were group interviews, the vast majority were one-on-one. And I found that the participants really, in that I guess, safe space, were really able to talk very openly about the challenges that they saw to building capacity, for people to be able to actually deliver evidence-based therapies, for the way that there's often not a full understanding of what psychotherapy is or how it's useful to patients or clients. And so we got some really rich data. And the document itself is really grounded in those ideas that came out of the initial consultations. So I want to be clear that I didn't go in there knowing what was going to go in here. I went in there and it was a real process of learning about what the landscape is like in BC right now. These were the various groupings of the participants I interviewed. So there were all of the regional health authorities and the Provincial Health Services Authority, some contracted agencies, and some staff from the Ministry of Health. Here were the themes that came out of the analysis of the data. The first one was around needing more consistent psychotherapeutic services across BC. And I think I'd go further to say that really it was about needing more services, not just more consistent services. There was a very strongly identified need for stronger clinical leadership. I think people often felt that the leadership was coming from a place that was not necessarily clinically informed. There was a recognition there, or certainly a theme around psychoeducational approaches and evidence-informed approaches, and how often they're understood to be psychotherapy when in fact they aren't, and the need for clarity around that so that we can actually provide a full range of services and not just have, we're doing trauma-informed practice, that means we're providing trauma services, for example, or, we're providing CBT-informed groups, but we're not necessarily then providing CBT. So just a real recognition that had become a very grey area where there are lots of checks in boxes that we're providing services that aren't actually evidence-based therapy. There was also a recognition that we do need better fidelity to evidence-based approaches, that it's sort of gone too far with people taking their own interpretations and bits and pieces of models and just delivering something in often in a watered-down way because of lack of enough time and space to really do it properly. So not enough sessions, too many clients, too much pressure, too much of a wait list. And the need also for whole family approaches. It's very common to be hearing stories of perhaps somebody providing a service to a child who presents with a psychological problem, and seeing that the parents themselves are in need of some services, but not having any kind of ability to open a file on that parent or on that family and provide that parent with any support, and feeling really quite an ethical dilemma around that, because how is the child going to benefit when really you can see they're in a family situation where the parent really needs support too. So there's a need for more whole family approaches. There's also been an increasing focus on very severe mental health presentations and substance use, and also to responding to crisis. And this really is a result of the just services and having to triage all the time. So you're always, going with the worst case scenario, most severe, the ones in crisis, most in need of help right now, which means that we can't do intervention with people who are moderately problems. It's really the crisis. One of the things that's really nice about Healthy Minds, Healthy People, when you look at it as a whole document, is the strong vision of upstream support. And when you look at that idealistic vision about how everybody's going to be so happy and healthy, that can really only be achieved by looking at mental health and substance use problems before they happen, looking at the predispositions, looking at the social determinants and addressing those, and also having early intervention in place so that we don't wait until problems become severe or people are in crisis before we then try and help them. There was a very strong message around personality disorders. A lot of the people that I interviewed had not only a mental health focus, but a broader focus on health, and recognized that often people with personality disorders are seeking other parts of the system. Not addressing the full range. We have increasingly had recognition of the dialectical behavioral therapy model, which is wonderful, and it's accessible to some clients. But as far as the full range of personality disorders, I know lots of you are familiar with the DSM. You know there's a lot more in there than borderline personality disorder. What can we do for people with other personality disorders? And again, even though I was saying, focus only on severe and crisis, there's also a recognition that the kind of psychotherapy services that my colleague at the back there was talking about earlier for very severe populations should be available to all of those clients, and not only the, I don't want to call them fortunate, but the few clients who just happen upon those services. They either live in the right location, or they happen to be referred, or their case has got so severe that they've been referred to a service. So, the psychotherapies, for example, for psychosis, should be available routinely in our psychosis services, not only for the So this is what went into the guiding document. These were the components that came out of that qualitative analysis of what came out of the initial interviews. So one of them was around professional roles and who should be delivering psychotherapy, and wanting to know about the scope of practice for each professional role. Now, this is actually not really the responsibility of the Ministry of Health. This is actually the responsibility of the regulating colleges, but not all of the people delivering mental health services or substance use services are actually regulated professionals. So I think there was a hope there that we might be able to develop some kind of scope of practice for unregulated professionals. I think what we're kind of moving towards is putting that responsibility back onto the team leaders and the administrators to properly align professional responsibilities with people's scope of practice as defined by their regulating bodies. So not necessarily to be asking unqualified or unregulated people to be doing the work of regulated professionals. Another piece was about supervisory roles. There's been a lot of confusion between what's meant by administrative supervision, which obviously we all need, and clinical supervision. And there's also some confusion around what mentoring and consultation mean and when they're required. So that was something that they really wanted explored in the guiding document. They wanted some clarity around that. They also wanted to know about these different therapeutic modalities. So when they hear about CBT, when they hear about DBT, when they hear about various psychodynamic approaches and so on, which of these therapies is really effective for treating which conditions, and how many sessions are required? So what are the benchmarks for modalities? And they also wanted to know what's going to be helpful for different subpopulations and what's going to be helpful for different cultural groups, and how does culture impact on our choices of psychotherapy. There was also a need, and this kind of links in with a lot of what we've already covered, to address ethical standards and dealing with ethical dilemmas. Again, there's a lot of guidance around that within the regulatory framework. So, you have a code of ethics and so on, But I think where it often gets difficult is when people are unregulated or where they don't necessarily have the clinical supervision that they need to be able to support them in making these. Had an hour of hearing about complex ethical issues. They're not unusual to come up, but what's really difficult is having a system where we don't necessarily have that clinical supervision in place, so that clinical colleague for you to refer to and kind of work things through with. What do you do? Then they also wanted to know about ideal training and treatment models, so the best approaches for providing clinical training for staff, for developing treatment models for various conditions and populations of clients, and guidance on how to maintain fidelity to models of treatment. And I think that that piece is really answered by some of the other pieces that we've talked about. If you have people working within their scope of practice, if we have good supervision, then we know which approaches work for which conditions, then a lot of that takes care of itself. Any questions so far? Yeah?
Just wondering.
I'm wondering about that too. So, yeah, I think with the purpose of the guiding document is to sort of set out what the best practices are. Our relationship at the Ministry of Health with the health authorities has been one of providing support, policy, guidance, and so on, and not getting into the details of how they do that and who they hire and so on. I think it's going to be... What comes from Ministry of Health?
Funding.
The funding might come from the Ministry of Health, but we don't necessarily tell health authorities how they should be spending their money. I'm not sure that that piece is going to change. However, if we set a policy document that clearly states what the best practices are around delivering psychotherapy, it's up to the health authority to then interpret that in terms of how they can kind of meet that policy. Does that make sense? I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, yes, it answers.
Right. So, yeah.
Is there
Yes. Yeah, and the competency section does speak to some of the things I've already spoken about. I'm just feeling a little uncomfortable that that question wasn't properly answered. Feel that there is a role for the ministry to be telling the health authorities, like break down to who they should be hiring and that kind of thing. No, this is learning for me as well. So, I've come here for a dialogue. So it's helpful if there is feedback to get the feedback. Yeah, I think there definitely would be a role for the ministry in terms of evaluation, when it kind of comes to the point of, and obviously some time needs to pass and health authorities need to have time to take in and make sense of the information and decide how they're going to make it useful. But absolutely, there would be some kind of mechanism for evaluating how these practices are working and how they're being implemented. Yeah, and
been missing, I think.
Right.
And there's lots of disconnect, right?
Right. So we do have evaluation frameworks as well. So that's another part of sort of the feedback loop. But I'd say that I think that things are somewhat in transition around how things move forward and how it operates between the Ministry of Health and the health authorities. So we'll kind of see how that unfolds over the next few years. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I think this is the first document of its kind. So I think this is a test case in itself of how these best practices will be taken on and implemented. I don't think we've had anything exactly like this, certainly not related to psychotherapy in BC before. So I think it's really important not to prejudge the process and predict or be too sort of pessimistic or cynical about how you think it's going to be used. Because, as I said right at the beginning, this is part of the ministry's commitment, right? So, and it's part of our new minister's commitment to fully implement well. So there's a lot behind this. There's a lot sort of saying, we want to make this happen. However, the ministry does not dictate to health authorities generally precisely how to do their work. They do have a certain amount of autonomy. Yeah, and the ministry has been very involved in the work that you're referring to. I don't see that work as inconsistent with what's happening here. Maybe as I go on a little bit in the presentation, you'll see a bit about what we covered. But we certainly have been looking at moderate and severe conditions. We have included substance use disorders as well as a range of other conditions. And what we're proposing is that we start treating those conditions using psychotherapy as opposed to purely by pharmacotherapy or restraint or law enforcement or indifference. So this is the piece as I see it, and I'm the only psychologist in the Ministry of Health, but as I see it, this is the missing piece of the puzzle. This is the big gap in mental health and substance use services. I may be biased in that view, but I have talked to all of these people in the health authorities who've been telling me the same message. So that's powerful to me, So I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about what we did, and then we can open up the discussion a bit more, if that's okay. I just want to make sure that we kind of cover the basics. But I'm really glad that you're engaging with this conversation, because that's a part of why I want to give presentations like this. I am interested in hearing, what the current climate is, taking it. So after doing these interviews and analysing the data, I presented this in a report to the Provincial Mental Health and Substance Use Planning Council back in January 2013. Now this planning council are really quite important for actually approving pieces that come forward. Even if they're in Healthy Minds, Healthy People, that was really the place where where the plans would be scrutinized. And they unanimously supported it and wanted us to go ahead with what had come out of this analysis. For me, that was a huge success. Some of the things that I was raising, I didn't know how they would be received. So to get this seal of approval to go ahead and do this work was really encouraging. And then in developing the guiding document, we combined an in-depth literature review of therapies used to treat 9 major groups of disorders in the DSM-5, which, as you know, came in partway through 2013, so partway through us developing this work. And we combined that with clinical expertise from our advisory committee that was comprised of about a dozen psychologists, psychiatrists, mostly psychologists actually, and people with lived experience. And we also had representation from the Aboriginal and Asian communities. So this was again reflecting some of what came out of those early interviews around, wanting the cross-cultural perspective, wanting to have approaches that were meaningful to different cultural groups given the diversity in BC. And we also used our clinical expertise to develop vignettes to represent the client experience and the therapeutic process over time. And I just want to say that I heard the critique of vignettes this morning. I completely agree with her. That's not what these vignettes are like. These vignettes are very real kind of stories, how people can present in very individualized ways and how the therapeutic process can guide them through. I also think that's a really important part of the message around psychotherapy, is to give easily digestible stories around how it can be quite transformative to people's lives. Because I think people who aren't involved in psychotherapy and don't do this kind of work see these interventions as fairly interchangeable and fairly standard, and you just put somebody into counselling and then they come out and they're either better or they're not. They don't really necessarily understand the intricacies of what we're doing. So we've got a little bit of that, although I'm sure as psychologists reading it, you'll think it's highly simplified, and we did have to. And then we also had a lot of additional consultation. There's some people in this room who weren't part of the advisory committee, but who very graciously offered their expert insights into developing the vignettes and the guidelines. We had at least as many advisors outside of the committee as we did inside the committee. And it was also reviewed by the Aboriginal Health Directorate in the Ministry of Health. And that's when it got really interesting for me. And then, so the next phase was really focusing on what's going to go into this document. How are we going to get all of this material somehow into some kind of digestible form? So we covered three main areas. One is defining what evidence-supported therapies are. There was so much confusion about that from the initial interviews. Does trauma-informed practice treat trauma? What's evidence-informed? What's evidence-based? What's psychoanalysis? What's CBT? And are they all the same? Why don't we just do the cheapest one? These kind of questions. So we're going to cover that. We're going to cover what therapist competencies are. And we're going to cover the moderate to severe mental health. That's slightly different from the way that it's framed in the 10-year plan, mainly because the 10-year plan spoke to psychotherapy being for mild to moderate conditions, and our mandate in mental health and substance use really being to look at the moderate to severe. So we do have quite a few things in place now for the very mild cases. So we've got enhanced family physician expertise through training and through guidelines and so on. So we're really looking at people who meet the criteria for sort of moderate to severe. And those, fortunately, those terminologies have now gone into the DSM-5 as well. So I'm feeling a little bit. Somebody suggested making a list of therapies, and then the list got longer and longer. And then they suggested that maybe there were branches that came out of other branches. And then they suggested a tree. And then when we started talking about Aboriginal culture, we realized that it wasn't branches of the same tree. It was a different tree, and there were branches that kind of reached towards but didn't really connect. And then we found that that was also the case with Asian culture, but it was a different tree that happened in a different part of the world with a very, very long history that is now overlapping with some of our best and strongest psychotherapies like dialectical behavior therapy and all of the mindfulness approaches that are grounded in Buddhist philosophy. So here we have this can't see the forest for the trees here. So I think one of the things that this diagram gets across is it's not straightforward. There's not really a list. It's complicated. It's something that's evolved over time, and it's evolved for real clinical reasons. People don't just create therapies because they feel like it, because they're not satisfied with what's there. It's because they find that something that they're doing might change the way that certain patients or clients respond to that, or something might, emerge from an interview and then develop into a clinical practice and then turn into a clinical trial and then turn into a new approach. So There's all kinds of ways that this happens, but I think, I have to give credit to the Aboriginal people who got involved with creating this document, because they were so forthcoming and so willing to engage in the conversation, which was actually very difficult for them. The first conversations that I had were, we're only interested in things that are for Aboriginal people. Well, I'm kind of hoping this might be for Aboriginal people too. And it was like, we don't really know. We were waiting for the Aboriginal Health and Wellness Plan to be released, and as with the DSM, that was released partway through the work and very clearly stated, I don't know how many of you have seen it, it's called A Path Forward. Very clearly stated, our mental health and substance use services need to be available and culturally appropriate to Aboriginal people, regardless of what Aboriginal specific services may also be available. We had to take this on, absolutely, and we had to look at what we were doing and our own paradigm, and that little tree in the middle that's a couple of 100 years old, and then the two trees to the side that are thousands of years old, and look at whether they really, match up, whether we're really providing services by kind of holding on to our one way of thinking is the right way around evidence-based services. So, any questions on the trees or comments? Then we also started looking about what we mean by evidence-based treatment. Really got a very strong message from our Aboriginal colleagues that CBT kind of approaches are often not seen as culturally appropriate. They're actually often seen as a symbolism. That kind of put us in a tricky place. We've got all this efficacy research around. And fortunately, there's quite a bit of literature now around the balance between efficacy and effectiveness. That's where kind of the symbol of the scales really comes into play, and we start thinking, well, when you're thinking about developing a service, you really need to find a balance between being grounded in the evidence and thinking about what's going to work for this person sitting in front of me. All of their cultural being and all of their individual being, things that they may have tried, things that they may have heard, prejudices that they may have as well. So we move towards trying to develop a clinical decision-making model for therapists that really puts the client at the center, with their own characteristics, their culture, their preferences, their choice. I was very inspired by the first speaker today and her conversation about when she sat down with Nancy, the psychotic client, who was talking about her voices telling her to hurt the therapist, and thinking about, the various ways that you could respond to that and the way that she responded to that. And I think it was a really beautiful example of client-centered work. I'm not saying everybody could do it. I'm not sure that I could do it. But she did it, and it worked. And in the course of that year, they achieved their goal. That goal might seem really modest, and it might not seem worthwhile to a lot of people. But for Nancy, I think it probably was really worthwhile. So that's about somehow stepping away from all this knowledge and training that you have that we've just been saying is so important and so missing from a lot of our services, and being able to connect with the human being in front of you and think, what's right for them? We also were caught up a lot of the time in thinking about when you start doing therapy. I've spoken to a little bit in Healthy Minds, Healthy People, when they talk about sometimes medications required to stabilize people. Well, sometimes you need a lot more than medication to stabilize somebody before you can start doing psychotherapy. Sometimes they need to be stabilized in all kinds of ways. And certainly you need to develop that therapeutic alliance before you start doing the work. You also need to figure out, the model that you're going to use and do that in consultation with the client. And if you look back there at the research evidence, is the research evidence that, is population specific, that you think is going to be particularly helpful for this client? There's something about the kind of person that they are or the demographic issues that are in front of you that might align with some work that somebody's done that show it be particular. Internal validity and what's the external validity, and really finding a good balance there. And also engaging in some conversation with your client around that. So getting true informed consent, not just I'm letting you know this is what CBT is and that's what we're going to be doing, but if you can, offering some options and some choice there. And then, as somebody was just mentioning about monitoring and evaluation, I think that's something that we have a responsibility for as clinicians as well. Really monitor ourselves and to think about, is this approach working? And I think sometimes all the pressure of, the wait list would just kind of get into the routine of this is what I do and this is how I do it, without really checking in, is it right for this individual person? Is this really working? Really reflecting on yourself, using the process of consultation and supervision that I know probably a lot of you aren't receiving adequately right now to be able to fully engage in that process, working with client feedback, and we've had some suggestions around sometimes using that. I know that's sometimes helpful for people. A lot of the time it's really just about listening to them and listening about what the process of therapy is like for them. And then also program evaluation. And I think there is a role for the ministry in that. But I don't want evaluation to be about something that we make you do to maintain your existence. I think this is really about offering good care and understanding that evaluating what you're doing and client satisfaction and so on is all part of that. Okay, so these are the key competencies. We don't get into the nitty-gritty of different, are you a social worker or a counsellor or any of that. That's what the colleges are for. But we do think it's important that we establish some benchmarks around safety, specifically violence, self-harm and suicide. We already talked about scope of practice and clinical competency, and we do want people to be practicing trauma-informed practice. So if you're not already familiar with it, there is a resource now available online. If you search under Trauma-Informed Practice BC, you can download the guidelines, and we really would like you to be reading them and following them. Supervision. So the therapist competency piece around bringing your ethical dilemmas to supervision, the accountability piece around that, and really being clear about the distinction between your administrative supervisor and your clinical supervisor, and then developing cultural competencies as well around cross-cultural work, Aboriginal competencies, which we recognise are very much in their infancy, and the LGBT population as well, which is particularly, and we had a presentation this morning about transgender people. We know that the weight of evidence is that aggressions that people have been referencing are a very real part of therapy for a lot of those clients, and we need to be aware of that. Often these microaggressions happen through ourselves and recognize when we may be actually doing harm. The major groupings of disorders covered in the document. Now moving towards the implementation phase, where we're going to be disseminating the document throughout the health authorities and to other stakeholders, because we're recognizing now that health services are a lot broader than just the health authorities. We have a science policy fellow, hopefully beginning in April, to help for a year on implementing this and hopefully consulting with some people like yourselves around how you might put this into practice. Break them into your and consulting with stakeholders to identify key priorities. So when you're covering this many disorders, we have 3 levels of benchmarks for each of them. We have a kind of minimum benchmark of what the evidence says is the most slender treatment model you could use. We have best practices, and then we also have potential areas for innovation. So we're kind of hoping that we will get key priorities from that. We're not going to be able to implement all of that right away everywhere. So what are going to be the easy wins? almost doing right now that we could enhance, we could build to the standard that's in the document, and then work with, hopefully in a very open kind of way, so that other services can learn from that. So they're using maybe a demonstration project kind of model. And then finally we need to, and I'm really hoping that the postdoc will help with this, develop a change management plan where we can establish relationships with best practice leaders throughout the province. And also do some focus groups to develop a strategy around change management. So we're not just saying, here it is, do it, but we're saying, what's this going to look like? How could this be feasible for you to put into practice? And then we also need to develop some resources to support change. And I'd really like to promote and have promoted through this document the use of practice-based evidence, as well as collaboration with researchers. And we've been hearing that there is research happening right here in BC on some of these emerging psychotherapies. This is something to really build a culture of good psychotherapy here in BC. And I'm also hoping that we can do some kind of provincial coordination, whether that's at the ministry level or through the, some kind of network or PHSA. That's all still to be worked out. So I'm just going to finish up now. I know I'm over time, but are there any questions? I know there was a hand up sort of part way through, and I cut you off and kept going, but did I already answer? Right. Right. Absolutely, and I think it's fundamental to client-centered care to have those conversations with the client so that they understand what they're taking on if they take a medication.
And right now,
Right.
these are the
Right.
they need to.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly growing recognition at the ministry level about the overuse of medications and of polypharmacy. And so this particular initiative is one of several that are recognizing that, and it's not just BC, it's all over North America and probably all over the world. We're just writing too many prescriptions for too many medications, and it's not always helping.
I certainly hope there'll be some indication of what would be an appropriate length of time for a person to have to wait to start therapy. Sometimes like 2 years from now, come and we'll talk about your depression isn't going to work for a lot of people.
Right. So some kind of guideline around that. Yeah, that guideline isn't part of this. But I think as we become more aware of what the evidence tells us about the benefits of psychotherapy, it will become easier to advocate for that. I think we really need to show, the proof of this. I don't think that people are always convinced that providing therapy is going to... You need to give that time. You need to give people time to deliver therapy and show some results. So I share your hope, and I think we need to use what we have here to demonstrate effectiveness. It's not going to happen straight away. Then again, this is a 10-year plan, not a 6-month plan, right? So we need to give it time to unfold. And this particular piece of work that I'm talking about has been going on for over 2 years now. That's just for the guidelines. That's not to say it isn't important, it's just to give it the space that it needs. Right. This particular document is focused on the adult population with a couple of exceptions. Our substance use services are all currently overseen by the Ministry of Health. So substance use services are not dealt with by the Ministry for Children and Family Development, not in children anyway. And the other exception is eating disorders, and that's mainly because the real wealth of evidence that we have is working with adolescents. It's a younger person's condition, unfortunately. So most of the document is focused on adult populations. I'm hoping that we will inspire our colleagues in the youth sector to write a similar document, and there's certainly been suggestions of that. Write a similar document around child and youth mental health.
We're good? Okay. Thanks, Elizabeth, and please join me. We're just going to take a 10-minute stretch break, and there's a little coffee outside. Dr. Karen Grant will be joining us after the break. She's been here all day. I've heard her speak many times. She's worth listening to regarding her expertise in trauma. So see you in about 10 minutes, and we'll just move forward again.
But I could
I was the lowest.
Yeah, everyone knows it's my MacBook Air
All your
across the
files
universe.
on it, yes.
Yeah, at least the pictures didn't come up of my dog.
I would like those. I would have enjoyed those tremendously.
It's put on your belt or wherever you want to.
Can't think. Okay.
Good.
Completely tuck it
Yeah.
in. There you go.
And
Okay.
this goes around your ear
Thank
and
you.
you get to be like Justin Bieber.
Okay. Oh, gee.
And just,
I don't have the haircut.
it's very bendy, so you can move it toward your mouth a little bit.
All right. On the ear first, the bendy part.
Introduce you.
Sure. Try And this is my clicker, right?
Nope.
Oh, just move that
Where
out
are
of
we?
the way then.
It just turned.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Okay, here we go.
Okay.
No,
No, take that away.
because we're using all kinds of technology, so
All
it's
right.
going to be this.
Oh, okay. So that's the forward. Okay, that's
Right?
easy.
So I'm just
That's
gonna
easy. Okay.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for hanging in here. We're at the end of our day, and I certainly have had the pleasure of hearing Karen talk before, and so I'm very pleased that you could join us again today with your great expertise in the area of trauma and refugee services. Dr. Karen Grant was most recently a psychologist at the Bridge Clinic, and she's moved on to private practice. And she's also been at Vancouver Coastal Health Community Health Care Center for Refugees, and now enjoys her active private practice. For almost 20 years, Dr. Grant has offered psychotherapy through the aid of interpreters to a wide variety of cultures and language groups. She has also been extensively involved in teaching, training, and consulting in the areas of multicultural psychology and social justice. Her work in this area also has included research on mental health interpreters and refugee access to health care. And today, Dr. Grant will be talking about integrated treatment of trauma in refugee populations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Grant. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Theona. I don't have to do it now. So what I was asked to offer you today is some observations and some ways that I have integrated some evidence-based therapies in order to be slightly more effective and more culturally appropriate in treating trauma with refugee populations. Is anyone here in the audience having worked with refugee populations before? Okay, one or two, great. Nice to see you. I want to start by giving you just a very, very brief snapshot of the kinds of refugees. That's a fast clicker. The kinds of refugees that come to Canada. Canada is one of the countries in the world that has agreed with the UN to receive refugees. Not every country in the world has done that. And since 2002, Canada has also agreed to accept those people who are in the worst conditions first. So those actually least able to settle quickly are the ones that we're bringing forward to resettle here. And they come with a complexity of medical and psychological problems, as you can well imagine. So those are usually called government-assisted refugees. They come through the Geneva Convention agreement that was started in the 1950s. There are also refugee claimants that come. Those are folks who arrive right at the Canadian airport or border and request asylum. Government-assisted refugee claimants come through a different process, and that's what I'm going to actually focus on the most today. So if you think you're never going to have a refugee client or patient, I'm going to really ask you to reconsider this. Canada brings in approximately 53 to 68,000 refugees a year, and they settle where? Toronto, Montreal, and in Greater Vancouver. So if you think of the accumulation over even a 3 or 4 year period, the chances that you will run across a family member or a person themselves who has come from extremely traumatized circumstances is increasing. Excuse me. The other factor that has just recently come up is that there used to be some specialized mental health services funded by the government for refugees as part of their resettlement, and the federal government has just recently cut all those services. So guess where they'll be coming to your doors. The prevalence of PTSD. Now, there are many trauma reactions, as you may well know. I'm going to reference PTSD because a lot of the refugees that I was treating at Bridge Clinic and earlier certainly had PTSD along with comorbid things like depression, anxiety, panic disorder, dissociative disorder, and so on. If you just think about the prevalence of PTSD, what we know is that only really 12.4% of the world trade workers in 9/11 actually developed PTSD. PTSD is not a given after a traumatic event, as you probably know. And why that's the case, well, we call it resiliency. We don't really know quite what that is. And a combination of earlier life experiences. USA veterans, and this is a similar stats for the Canadian Forces, I believe, about 24%, or about a quarter of them develop PTSD, which is why you may have seen a lot in the papers recently about more funding going towards supplying trauma treatment for our returning peacekeepers. I did actually work with returning peacekeepers for a while. I've also worked with police officers, firefighters, and victims of crimes. But in refugee populations, what we know is that we can say only 4% of a population will develop PTSD, or maybe 86% will. You can see this incredibly vast span. And what do you think the reason is why we would have statistics about the development of trauma reactions over such a wide variety? Okay, if you don't know. Really, it comes down to the length of exposure, multiple exposures, cultural factors that either enhance resiliency or reduce it, all those kinds of multiple factors. So you will see in some refugee groups a very low incidence. Recently we had, I think the word is going to escape me, the name of the people. Recently we had some refugee groups from Eastern Asian countries, Southeastern Asian countries that were, by and large, a little more mentally stable than ones that we received from the Middle East and in Africa, for example. So, but what compounds this is not only can we have a very high incidence of trauma reactions in a refugee population, such as many people now are coming from Iraq, many people came from Afghanistan. What we know is that about 45% of them are still in extreme distress, chronic extreme distress, 3 to 5 years after their arrival in Canada. And I'll explain why that may be the case in a little while. What I want you to think about is how trauma develops in refugee populations, traumatic experiences, and the multiple exposures to traumatic experiences that refugee populations often have. So they have, of course, what is happening in their home country. And we're going to look a little bit about what the sources of trauma are there. Then there is a migration that they have to go through from their home country to the first country of refuge. Now, government-assisted refugees, those who come through the UN, must secure safety in a country outside of their home country to apply to the UN to ask for the status of being a refugee. So, for example, Pakistan has, I think, something like 600,000 people in camps presently who have come from Syria, who have come from Afghanistan, and some from other countries. And they are waiting there for status to be granted before the UN then says you will be resettled in a country, your host country. So there are traumatic events that happen both in the country during their flight and then again in the country of refuge that they first seek. When we're talking about refugee trauma, as we heard earlier today, we're really talking about the interpersonal sources of trauma, which we know have a much higher prevalence of developing serious post-trauma reactions such as PTSD. There are certainly refugee groups that come as a result of natural disasters, but primarily we are looking at groups of people who have come through the relational betrayals that we heard about earlier in Dr. Burrell's talk. So whether they're forced to leave or they are forced to make a plan, nobody wants to leave home. These are not people who've said, I think I'd like to come and live in Canada. They do think Canada's a great place, but they didn't ever want to leave, unlike immigrants who have some sense of autonomy in their choice, even though they might not be very happy with their choice later. The sources of interpersonal trauma are, as I've said, many and very, very often multiple. So the accumulation of these traumatic experiences can be lifelong. Sometimes they're acute within a discrete period of time, but quite often when you're talking about countries such as Iraq and Afghanistan, you're talking about generational trauma. If you speak to someone from Afghanistan, for example, they'll tell you, we've known 1,000 years of war. And so I want you to keep in mind the aspect of intergenerational trauma actually affecting the individual who is presently going through some very horrific circumstances. So they experience trauma due to bombings, occupation, mass destruction and violence, imprisonment, disappearances or murder of family and friends, the devastation of their houses, their villages, agricultural land destroyed, and as a result from that, many suffer from starvation, dehydration, sleep deprivation. It's very hard to get a good night's sleep when bombs are falling all night, and a lack of medical treatment while they're still in their home country, even if resources used to be much better in that country before the conflict arose. This pre-migration experience, these are drawings from Tamil children, by the way, from Sri Lanka, refugees from Sri Lanka. The pre-migration refugee experience also often includes witnessing executions, mutilations, and I'm going to say defilement of the dead. There are things that refugees have experienced that you have never imagined in your life, and I hope you never have to hear most of them. There is a very, very high incidence of rape and sexual assault in both genders, horrendous violations to their personal and physical integrity and dignity, pregnancy from rape, HIV, STDs from rape, and severe injuries to the pelvis and to the anus. Torture. I'm not going to describe to you the things that I have heard that people have endured when they were tortured. Again, I'm going to say it's beyond your imaginings. But torture is, in my view, the most damaging to your sense of identity, to your sense of safety, and to your sense of belonging in the world. It is incredibly destructive to the person. And I need to tell you that if you're working with someone who's been imprisoned, it's very likely they've been tortured. And that also includes children. If you don't know this, torture of children in the world is much more common than you would like to know. And if you hear stories of children who were kidnapped in their home countries, even if it's only for a week, I can guarantee you they're not going to tell you everything that happened during that week. Well, that's what's happening before they leave. So now, they have been forced to leave, and very often their journey to safety is a very prolonged one that they may have to hide for days, weeks, months, even years in very inhospitable environments. I have worked with more than one person who has spent 2 years in a mountainous area living off of whatever they could find to eat, and several people who had to journey from Vietnam into Cambodia by living in the jungle and traveling on foot in the jungle. And it took them a very, very long time. So they also experience extreme temperatures, lack of food, water, risk of injury, and disease. It's also very common for people at this point to either lose track of family members or make a decision to have family members travel in different ways. And then they don't find each other at the other end. And sometimes this is let's send the children here, perhaps they'll have a greater chance of safety, and we'll go this route, and eventually we'll meet them in the refugee camp in the country that we're headed to. The International Red Cross does help people try to find lost family members. It's very good work they do, but it's certainly not always successful. The other way people journey to a country of refuge is through human smugglers. And I'm going to make a distinction here. Human traffickers actually buy and sell people for purposes of making a profit off of them, particularly in the crimes of prostitution and child pornography. Human smugglers may or may not be criminals. They are paid to take the dangerous journey with people across a border, and it costs a lot of money to get fake ID, and it quite often one has to compromise oneself by having sex with the human smuggler, by doing favors and offering things that they would otherwise never have done, because it is simply their only route out of the country. So no matter what you might hear in the media, the journeys are of incredible hardship, and the people are taking them as a last resort. So when they reach their first country of refuge, I've got a couple of pictures here of refugee camps. So there are 39 million people in refugee camps currently, according to the UN, and many camps hold hundreds of thousands of people, even millions of people. And they are places where even basic survival sources are extremely scarce. Now, the United Nations and the International Red Cross do try to supply these camps with food and medical provisions and water, clean water, but the length of time that many of these camps are having to exist just dries up resources, and it becomes increasingly difficult to supply people with all that they need, and especially as the population grows and continues to grow. So many camps around the world, such as the Karen is an ethnic minority who had to go to Thailand to take refuge. They've been in their refugee camps there for 25 years. So whole generations have lived out their adult lives in a refugee camp. And in Palestine, there's 50 years the camps have existed. This is a camp in Afghanistan for internally displaced people, so sometimes people can't get out of their country, but they escape to a region in the country, in this case where the Taliban activity was less. But these are still under deplorable conditions and are not aided necessarily by the International Red Cross or by the UN. Overall, in camps, now if you think about a person being in a camp, whether you're talking about a child or youth or an adult, they're in there for a long period of time. Okay? So within the camps, the way they operate is often based on an organized crime system. There's very common occurrences of rape, assassinations, forced prostitution, extortion, beatings, hunger, lack of clean water. And what is really key to deteriorating mental health is forced idleness for prolonged periods of time. I want you to take a look at this picture again and look at how much space is there around each of these makeshift tents. There's no room for people to move, to exercise. There's no room for children to play. And they're not allowed, except in the Southeast Asian, some of the camps did allow people to go out and work, but routinely they're not allowed to leave the camp area for years. And of course, the common diseases that then people come from refugee camps to Canada with are TB, parasites, malaria, cholera, dysentery, HIV, and all the various forms of hepatitis on top of their mental anguish. Once they arrive, there's typically a period of elation that lasts maybe about 2 weeks before they really bottom out into what we used to call culture shock. Now we call adjustment stress, which can also become an adjustment disorder. And it's about the profound experience of being in a totally different world. And the majority of people who are coming to us are coming from cultures that are vastly different than Western European cultures. There was a time when North America's refugees came from Europe primarily. But now it's definitely from developing countries around the world, such as Africa, Middle East, and Southeast Asia. And there are vast differences in cultural beliefs and practices. There are also, I remember working with a woman from the Sudan who was in a nomadic tribe situation, had never seen a vehicle, had never seen a toilet, and so had never seen a stove that you would cook on. So you can imagine the incredible effect of shock that comes to them when in 2 weeks they have to learn Canadian banking systems, Canadian bus systems, and how to get their kids into school. When you're working with a refugee population, you have to always factor in to this adjustment stress that they are also under in their current context. It's not necessarily that they're rhapsodizing about the safety that they feel. They don't feel that immediately, sometimes not for a very long time. So really, if you're working with people who have been refugees, you need to think about their presentation of symptoms as a very complex pattern of their own personal and cultural interpretation of what they've been through, what the meaning of those traumatic events have been, what has been taken from them, loss of identities, loss of trust, loss of so many people have experienced deep, close personal betrayals by relatives because of social strife. And not to mention the very concrete trauma experiences that they've had, whether those be directly or by witnessing the atrocities. How many people want to enter this work? It is important to know because, as I said, not only are we consistently taking in refugee families and settling them in just 3 areas mainly in Canada, but also the intergenerational effect, because children are coming and they may come at a young age and they may adapt in the school system very quickly and seem like they're doing okay, but their parents are quite shattered. And their parents may not speak English, so sometimes we can't even access and do a full assessment on what is happening in the family when we're trying to work with a child or youth. So I think it may seem really obvious that trauma work with traumatized refugees is extremely complicated and difficult. It offers you lots of opportunities for secondary trauma on your own or vicarious trauma, however you like to think about that. And unfortunately, research into the effectiveness of Western techniques for this population is still really sparse. And the reason for that is you can see it's effective for a certain sector of Iraqi population, but you can't generalize that across all Middle Eastern cultures. They have to be culturally specifically validated, and you can imagine the enormity of that task. So what you really have to do, and those of you who have worked with cross-cultural already know this, you really have to adapt treatment for cultural appropriateness and still offer what we know to be evidence-based practices. It's an area of justice to provide equal treatment for all, but we also have to recognize some of the treatments are exclusively designed based on Western values and beliefs and Western understandings of how to think and how to solve problems. Just a quick review of the evidence-based practices for PTSD. Most of them are CBT-based. The gold standard is any kind of prolonged exposure therapy, usually imaginal exposure. Cognitive processing therapy. Have anybody heard of cognitive processing? Yeah. So the shift there is a little bit to tempering the exposure part by having the client write out their traumatic experiences and work to with the therapist to then also include some more positive cognitive frameworks for those experiences. I can tell you that when I was deep in the work at Bridge Clinic, I took training for cognitive processing therapy, but I was very defeated by the end of it because half the people I worked with were non-literate in their own language, and certainly were not literate in English. And so the idea of trying to get them to write anything out was beyond their abilities. And people who are non-literate actually don't think. I can't speak to this because I'm not a language expert, but there's a different way of thinking in pictures rather than in the narrative streams are different. It's my understanding anyway. So EMDR is sometimes debated, but I think generally recognized to be quite effective in the treatment of trauma. Personally, I've never been able to do this to someone from the Sudan who isn't really comfortable sitting on my chair. So I didn't use it in those treating those populations. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm not saying that at all. But I didn't, in the clinic, I didn't use that. Psychopharmacology has proved effective. SSRIs are the medications of choice, although a lot of antipsychotics are often used as well. Because the severity and the chronicity of some PTSD in these populations often includes psychosis, hearing voices, dissociation, a lot of very severe effects. So where I went with this was I took a look at the work of John Briere. Anybody familiar with John Briere? He often comes and talks with Bessel van der Kolk about trauma. And if you're not, he has a wonderful website, and he offers all kinds of articles that he's written at no charge, quite a generous offering on his part. So he talks about kind of a broader view of the components that are used to treat PTSD. And I'm going to actually offer you 2 case examples after I go through this of how I actually integrated some of the evidence-based therapies in my work. He really talks about, of course, the therapeutic relationship, which is crucial to everything. Without it, nothing works. With it, everything works. Psychoeducation, stress reduction and affect regulation skills, cognitive interventions, the opportunity to produce a coherent narrative, and then some degree of guided exposure to the memories and activities that increase self-awareness and self-acceptance. So the ones that I've highlighted here in gold are the pieces I'm going to offer you some examples of in the 2 case studies that I have to show you. So he's talking about an integration of evidence-based practices to make them more adaptable to, I'm not sure if I missed that slide or not, but to help them be appropriate for a broader range of individual experiences of trauma and individual needs for treatment. It includes cultural differences. I'm going to tell you about a woman who I met who was in her early 20s. She had come as a refugee from a Muslim country in Africa. And she was possibly the most dissociative person I had worked with up to that date. She had very limited ability to be present in a session, would get lost on the SkyTrain on her way to see me, and had absolutely flat affect. I mean, she was really gone most of the time. She also was so terrorized by nightmares that she would force herself to stay awake by locking herself in a closet so she felt safe and keeping a flashlight on. And sometimes she would read the Bible just to keep herself awake. Now notice she read the Bible, but she was from a Muslim country. So she would sit in my office with absolutely frozen body posture, no eye contact, just really locked in her fear, the way that I envisioned her being locked in the closet every night. And so what I decided to start with was, of course, what stage 1 CBT PTSD treatment always starts with, is using some grounding techniques to try to bring her out of the dissociative states, at least part of the time. But I also wanted to incorporate some of the mindfulness practices that are proving so promising in the treatment of trauma and other and depression. So what I did was working with, if you just take the mindfulness piece for a bit, if you use mindfulness as it's usually introduced with people who have had severe interpersonal traumas, such as this young woman, having them pay attention to some of their body sounds can be immediately triggering. So teaching her the breath, are you familiar with the breath in mindfulness, was instantly triggering for her. She could not listen to her own breath because the violence that had been perpetrated on her, she was left alone in a cell over and over and over again to listen to her own breathing and her own heartbeat until the violators came again. And I found with her that any real paying attention to any body awareness was incredibly difficult for her. She would just dissociate. So I decided to take her for a walk, and I wanted to do mindfulness with her. It's not mindfulness walking, if some of you are familiar with this, where you really pay attention to the foot on the ground. I wanted to externalize her awareness completely to ground her so that she would stay present and stay feeling safe. A little caveat here, I would not use this with someone who was terrified being out in the open, and many people are. But for those who aren't, she was afraid of being in large crowds, but where we went to walk, there was not that was not a factor. So to locate her in the present, I took her to a community garden that was quite close to Ravensong Community Health Center, actually. And I walked and talked with her, noticed the shape of the leaves, noticed the color that's different in every leaf, noticed the texture of the tree. That just talked and talked and talked, taking her through all 5 senses as we walked. So I did actually have her go out and touch things to see how things feel in this garden, but it was a safe, she was touching it. It wasn't drawing her attention to what was touching her. So we did this walk several times. And then what I did was, in my office, I found a picture on Google Images, one of my favorite sites now. That was a community garden somewhere in Vancouver. And we printed out this picture in color, and we would sit in my office and have her learn to ground herself with this picture through the same 5 senses. Imagine what you can hear, imagine what you can taste, imagine what you can smell, and so on. And then she would take that home to practice with when she was not feeling anxious. So I started her using it before she was elevated. This client stopped seeing me for a while. Often this is the case. But I got a call from her, and she said, "I'm very distressed." And I said, "Can you come in?" And she said, "I'm pretty far away." I said, "Where are you?" She said, "I'm in the park. I've been walking and noticing everything in the park." So she had actually started to do this for herself outside of the picture. She actually ended up quite well at the end, not just due from my interventions, but from a team of people that were helping her. And her own remarkable resilience. The idea of stage 1 PTSD treatment, where you have someone envision a safe place so that you know when you are titrating the exposure that they have the opportunity to go back to the safe place, can be extremely problematic in refugee populations where there has been 1,000 years of war. Because they will look right at you and say, I don't even know what that would feel like. I can't imagine a safe place. I've never felt that in my life. Very different from treating people who've had discrete traumas, but bracketed by experiences of safety. Very, very different. So what I tried to do, similarly as to what I did with the young woman I just spoke about, was ask them to look at images on Google, and I would just talk to them, do you like being indoors or do you like being outdoors? Or if you like being indoors, what makes you feel good when you're indoors? What makes you feel good? And we just just kind of roam through these pictures, and it was amazing how they would key into some of the, I'm not showing it to you, some images that we found very quickly. And they were, as you can see, often extremely different places than they would have ever grown up in. My favorite is the snow-covered cabin. Looks like there should be maple syrup on the table and maybe a moose in the backyard. But, and as you can see, one person picked images of inside a church. One person was extremely calmed by watching happy children playing, which is something she had not seen in a very, very long time. So when they chose these images, then I would do the same 5 senses grounding technique with them and send them home with those pictures. I didn't take any of these folks out for walks. In this case, I was offered the opportunity by the client to combine narrative therapy with exposure, guided exposure. This was a man who had been imprisoned for 2 years in Iraq. He had no religious faith. He wasn't Muslim, he wasn't Christian, he wasn't anything. And he happened to be working prior to the war for an American company in Iraq in technology. When the war broke out and the Americans came, he was arrested and seen as a terrorist or potential terrorist, and so was put into a prison that the Americans had put up in Iraq. The Americans, from his account, ran the prison from a distance. They didn't do anything themselves, but the compound was very huge, and you can envision that he drew the picture for me, where you would have like 300 tents, and each tent would have 30 men in them. They were quite vast compounds. So what happened for him was, when I saw him, he again was completely flat, no affect, reported no feelings positive or negative, just nothing. Completely numb, had no hope for the future, and was completely detached from life events. He had just had a new baby, which is culturally the greatest blessing that can happen, and he was completely detached from that occurrence in his life, had no interest in the baby whatsoever. And I saw this very much as adaptive avoidance, because he had spent 2 years in this camp where he was under constant threat of death. In the camp were Al-Qaeda people as well, who, for example, would make him tell him to recite the Quran, and they'd give him a verse. And they would kill people who couldn't do this, or who didn't have a beard, or whatever their fundamental principles were. So he told me, first session, he said, I'm not crazy. I said, well, that's really good, because I actually don't treat crazy people, so this is good. We're working together here. And he said, all I need to do is for someone to hear my story. I thought, golden opportunity. So we agreed that he would come in every session and he'd tell me part of his story. He said, your job, just let me know where I left off. Next time you see, you tell me where I left off. So I agreed to that, and he began telling me his experience over 6 sessions. This is some of the briefest therapy I've ever done. What I did was I listened and I did keep track, But I took the opportunity out of narrative therapy to interject in a very, very respectful and gentle way whenever I heard a moment of resilience or ingenuity in him. So when he started his story, it was very much the story of a victim. But I didn't comment on any of the traumatic experiences he had. I just listened, I just witnessed those. And then when he said, but they didn't kill me because I did this, I would say things like, how did you think to do that? What in that moment came to you that inspired you to do that, to save your own life? This comes from partly also from the work of Alan Wade, who has written about acts of living, everyday resistance to violence and other forms of oppression. And when he works with people, he highlights their acts of resistance. And he's worked a lot with our First Nations people along those lines. So what happened was he came in for his last session. We just did this. I didn't comment much. I would just highlight them, which is the kind of the unique outcomes that narrative therapy looks for. He came to the last session and he said, I'm enjoying life more than I ever have. I'm taking my baby to the park. I'm playing. I really feel I have a future in Canada, and I feel that my past is finished. And the understanding was that he had been transformed from victim to the hero of his own story. So, if you find yourself in this work, I leave you with these suggestions, a survival toolkit. And I didn't add incredibly good self-care, but that should be paramount. It's really good for you to have an integrated team, medical support and settlement support when you're working with people. It cannot be siloed off because of the complexity of what they're trying to adjust to and recover from. If you're using interpreters, and I've spoken at length about this in other venues, you need to take advantage of their ability to be your cultural consultant. It's very difficult to build trust with people who have been multiply traumatized, and the interpreter can act as a cultural bridge. You're still in control, you're the clinician, but there can be quite a bit of safety created by a respectful relationship between you and the interpreter. And
your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
That would be my cue. Everybody else just got Teo, but I get that. That's great. I really highly recommend using EBTs, but to really think about ways that they can be incorporated into that person's world and understanding of what is going to help them. Thank you. Any questions? I don't know if we have time, but...
Yes, absolutely. I have a quick question.
Sure.
And I just want to thank you for doing this important work. It's profound, it's important.